After the conclusion of the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union still had unresolved tensions. These 45 years of stress and fear of the unknown became classified as the Cold War. The possibility of nuclear warfare was a very serious and plausible threat that weighed heavily on the minds of Americans and Soviets in the year 1962, while the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. It was during this time of fear and anxiety that the Soviet Union and the United States had to find a compromise to ensure the safety of their people and the dignity of their country. The U.S. were a part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. NATO was designed to help prevent the spread of communism. A country who opposed NATO was the Soviet Union. Their premier, Nikita Khrushchev, believed in a communist government and was a threat to the treaty's plan to extinguish communism. Due to the Soviet Union attempting to spread communism throughout Germany, the United States placed missiles in Turkey on June 1st, 1961. The Soviet Union felt that the missiles were a threat to their country and their way of life, and continued to become weary of the United States. Cuba became involved with the conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, where Fidel Castro, the Prime Minister of Cuba, came to power in 1959. The United States was fearful of him installing another communist government. To further the attempts to destroy Castro's communistic leadership style, the U.S. decided to put in place Operation Zepeda. Operation Zepeda was a plan to invade Cuba with 1,400 trained Cuban exiles, overthrow the government, and finally assassinate Fidel Castro, known as the Bay of Pigs. When information of the invasion was leaked, Cuba asked the Soviet Union for help. The Soviet Union agreed to install missiles to defend Cuba as a form of revenge for the United States placing missiles in Turkey. The swamp-like conditions, along with Cuban preparation for the attack, led the United States' failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. On December 2nd, 1961, Fidel Castro made the ultimate declaration against the United States, when he declared himself a communist, stating, "The United States made me one." The tensions continued to rise on October 14th, 1962, when an American spy plane flew over Cuba and took photographs of apparent missile sites. According to U.S. military experts, these sites held nuclear missiles built by the Soviet Union. The United States was dismayed upon hearing of these sites and became increasingly cautious of the Soviet Union and Cuba's intentions. 2 days later, on October 16, 1962, United States President John F. Kennedy was informed that in 10 days, these missiles would be completely operational. Seeking guidance, he called together the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as EXCOM. EXCOM decided that the presence of these missiles was not acceptable. However, they were fearful that the missiles would be detonated if they did not approach the proposition of their removal carefully. With these suggestions in mind, President Kennedy set up a meeting with the Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko, to come to calm the situation. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy finally made his decision to enforce a military blockade on Cuba. President Kennedy informed the American public with a broadcasted speech where he said, "Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability. I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. This government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail." On October 23, 1962, Premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, responded to Kennedy's announcement in a letter saying, "You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather an ultimatum. Khrushchev continues on to state, "I cannot agree with this, and I think that deep inside, you will admit that I am right. I am convinced that if you were in my place, you would do the same." Despite reading this letter, the United States was in deliberation of what their next course of action would be. On October 24th, the United States enforced the blockade. The anxiety dramatically rose as a Soviet Union ship that was boarded with missiles approached the 500-mile blockade zone. The United States Navy, assigned to watch the blockade, anxiously waited to see the outcome. When it appeared as though the ships would not cease their progression toward the blockade, they prepared a naval strike. Suddenly, the 20 ships that were nearest to the blockade zone abruptly stopped. The Navy guards waited apprehensively, keeping a close eye on the Soviet ships. Then, with great relief, the Soviet ship began to retreat. The United States Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, stated, "It was eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked." However, the success of the United States pushing Soviet ships to retreat was short-lived when aerial shots of Cuba showed a rapid increase of missile bases. This hard photographic evidence was taken of a Soviet deployment of medium-range ballistic missiles and intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. The United States was taken aback by this information, realizing the problem was still not resolved. On October 27, 1962, Nikita Khrushchev wrote a letter to John F. Kennedy. He promised to pull the missiles out of Cuba if the United States removed the missiles from Turkey. This same proposal was previously declined by the United States. On October 28th, President Kennedy met with the Executive Committee of the National Security Council once more to propose yet another invasion plan on Cuba in hopes that this plan will prove to be more successful. It was during this meeting when Kennedy learned that Khrushchev declared he would dismantle all missiles in Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union in exchange for extraction of U.S. missiles in Turkey and a pledge not to invade Cuba. It was at this point in time when he finally agreed to dismantle the missiles in Turkey. His only request was that Khrushchev gave him time to talk to the Turkish leader, Cemal Gürsel. President Kennedy was fearful that removing the missiles from Turkey would anger Gürsel and other members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Nikita Khrushchev began removing the missiles immediately from Cuba after hearing the United States agreement to his compromise. As said by John F. Kennedy, "Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom. Here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world, God willing, that goal will be achieved." The Cuban Missile Crisis is a perfect example of conflict and compromise. The conflict rose because of increased nationalism and the belief of superiority between governments in the United States and the Soviet Union. Without the U.S. and Soviet Union's ability to communicate effectively and agree to a compromise, the world would have been faced with a nuclear war with a devastating consequence. Because of communication and compromise, millions of lives were saved.